Well, hello, everyone. It's really good to be here. My name is Gabriel Reynolds. I teach in the World Religions, World Church program at the University of Notre Dame in the Department of Theology, and welcome back to the Global Church program, and in particular to this series on the Church in Asia. I'm really delighted to be speaking again with my friend and colleague, Dr. Xueying Wang, and I'll introduce just in a moment our special guest on this third and final session of the Church in Asia series, Professor Michael Agliardo. This is going to be really great because we've been exploring more sort of the history of Christianity in China, its relationship with Buddhism, and we're going to get up to the present moment. So we're going to speak about the Church in China today and address a lot of the questions that I saw participants were asking and we're interested about. So we'll get to a lot of them today. And yeah, it's really exciting and an important topic for the Church in the world. So friends, as I mentioned, our topic today brings us up to the present day, and we'll be asking questions such as how has the Church in China addressed and overcome social, cultural, and political obstacles? How do young people in China view the Church? What is the Church's relationship with other Christians, that is Catholics, Protestants, and there's even a small Orthodox community in China? And what is the Church's relationship with non-Christian religions? These are some of the questions we'll address in this final Think ND session of the Church in Asia. And as always, we'd like to just take a moment to thank our co-sponsors, the Tantor Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, and Notre Dame International and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. You just saw in the chat box that there's a form that was shared, and that's the form that you'll use to ask questions. So we'll have a conversation of about 30 or 35 minutes between with Professor Wang and Father Agliardo about the Church in China, but then we're going to save time for questions from you. So you can submit those questions at any point. So go ahead and submit your question now, and that will populate a little spreadsheet on my end. So I'll see the questions and I'll see where you're coming from. Go ahead and mention your town and state or country there, and I'll see that as well. And we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But let me go ahead and introduce our guest briefly. It's a pleasure to be speaking about the Church in China with a really distinguished expert on the topic, Father Michael Agliardo, Executive Director of the U.S.-China Catholic Association, a nonprofit that works to build fraternal ties between Catholics in the United States and in the People's Republic of China. Father Agliardo is also visiting research scholar in the Department of Sociology at Santa Clara University. His research focuses are environmental sociology, the sociology of religion, the sociology of culture with a focus on China. And while at Santa Clara, he completed data collection for a 5-country study of a different topic, although we alluded to environmental sociology, but a 5-country study on the reception of Pope Francis's encyclical on ecology and the Church's responsibility, Laudato Si. So welcome, Father Agliardo. Thanks for being here.
Well, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. I thank you very much, Gabriel, for welcoming me.
It's great to have you. And as I already mentioned, and as you see, we're joined by Professor Xueying Wang, alumna of Notre Dame's Theology Department, where she did her doctorate, and professor at Loyola, Chicago. So hello, Xueying, and I think you'll take it from here.
Thank you so much for having me again, Professor Reynolds, and welcome, Father Agliardo, and thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your insights about the Catholic Church in China. And before I get to the questions, I would like to just express my gratitude for the wonderful work that you do at the U.S.-China Catholic Association. And you're the Jesuit that carries forward the tradition started by Matteo Ricci. So as a Chinese Catholic, I'm deeply grateful. Also, for those of you who are interested, the USCCA hosts annual conference during the summer usually, and also numerous exciting lectures on the topic of Catholicism in China. And for those of you who want firsthand experience of Catholic in China, Father Michael also leads study tours. So for the details, please check out the website of US-China Association. All right, so now let's start the questions. So Father Agliardo—
I want to thank you for the advertisements there. I didn't even have to pay for that one.
I was at the conference in June, which was really like maybe one of the best conferences I've ever been to. So, okay, Father Liardo, the first question I have today is actually, so could you tell us, give us just an overview or a general introduction to the Catholic Church in China? This is a broad question, but what are some distinctive features of the Catholic communities in China?
Well, I noticed, I overlooked some of the questions that you sent, and they're all quite broad. So they give you a lot of latitude for offering a few reflections. So I'll try to very quickly sketch a church that has a 400-year history in a country with 1.4 billion people. So let's see what we can do here. So the Catholic Church in China is actually a very small minority of the population. There are perhaps 12 million Catholics in China. So I think one of the questions you asked is what do earlier in the program, it was asked, what do ordinary Chinese think of Catholics? Well, mostly they don't, because they're kind of a hidden minority, and religion doesn't stand out in the foreground in public life in China as it is. So it's a small group, but they're concentrated in a number of regions. In the Shanghai region, there's a long and storied history of the church, Hebei province, and a number of other places. It's also true that the Catholic Church, during at least 3/4 of its history, was largely rural in nature. Catholicism is a communal religion. We share the faith with others. We share holidays and the rhythm of the seasons and communal practices like processions and so forth. And so it's not an individual faith, a faith of just ideas. It's something that you share with others, again, with your meal practices and fasting and so forth. And so early missionaries focused on working with groups and communities. And also there was an early history of persecution under the imperial regime for a number of reasons that we won't go into right now. Despite an early strong welcome of Catholicism, there were periods of persecution. And so that meant that Catholics sort of went into the hinterlands to avoid the spotlight. And so the church grew often in whole villages in the countryside. So you go throughout the Chinese countryside, and then you all of a sudden see a church steeple and a cross, and you come across a town that was largely Catholic, if not all Catholic. And then you could go for miles and miles and not meet another Catholic again. I'm going to digress and tell you a short little story about the first time I went to China in 1991. I was in the city of Xi'an, where there are the terracotta warriors. I was in the cathedral, and a young boy had come in from a little town in the countryside, one of these Catholic villages, with his mom, and he hadn't been to the big city very often, and he was kind of in awe. I think he was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and he saw me in the cathedral. Now, up until this point, he thought of his little village as like the entire Catholic world, and everybody else outside the village was not Catholic. There are obviously some Catholics in the city of Xi'an and the cathedral, but he was shocked to see me there. And he said, Mama, 没想到, 西方人也是教友. Even Westerners are Catholic. He had no idea. He thought his village was the Catholic universe. So that was the pattern of Catholicism. It's kind of a rural, village-based religion. But it began to, there were a number of cities where it did flourish, as I mentioned. And also Catholicism during its early history was in China a mission endeavor. So many different religious orders would go to China, and they would say, well, we'll concentrate the Franciscans will concentrate in Hunan, and the Jesuits will concentrate in Zhili, an old province under the Qing dynasty. And they divided China up into these mission territories, and each order then took responsibility for bringing the faith there. But as a result, China got divided up into a patchwork of different territories and missionary strategies. Some people reached out to different minority ethnic groups, so you can go up into Yunnan and find Tibetan Catholic areas or Miao Catholics and so forth and so on. So it's largely rural and so forth. But after the West began to engage China, sometimes through force, after the Opium Wars, and China was forced to open up, Catholicism also began to grow in the cities. Then in 1926, I believe, the Pope invited six priests to China and ordained them the first bishops, at least the first bishops in modern time in China. And China began to move toward becoming not so much mission territory, but a self-governing church like we have here in the United States. So that by 1949, China was well on the way to becoming an autonomous church of its own. And in fact, that was fortunate because in 1949, the Communist Party took over governance of China. And in their mind, this was the opportunity for China to stand up and declare its independence. And just as they had forced the Japanese invading forces to leave their country, they also wanted all other foreigners who were dominating China to leave as well. And eventually, they also expelled the missionaries, foreign missionaries who were operating in China. They wanted their country back, and they saw these missionaries as linked to the colonial powers. So it was unfortunate that that way of seeing Catholicism did arise, but Catholics themselves could point to their own long history of having accepted the faith, not because of any colonial rule, but because it spoke to the heart. And Catholics themselves held on to their faith after the missionaries left. And in a certain sense, that the missionaries left was perhaps one of the greatest gifts that the Communist Party could have given to China, because Chinese themselves were ready to run their own church, take responsibility for their faith, and appreciate the significance of it. Unfortunately, there were difficult times, and there was a lot of prejudice against foreign faiths, both Protestant and Catholic, in China because of these associations, and because, again, Marxism officially does not espouse faith. It sees faith as false. I mean, I'm a sociologist. I've studied Marxism. I understand their perspective on this. Unfortunately, this has meant that they began to restrict religion. They thought without any missionaries to prop up religion, people would just give it up. And then in 1966, something called the Cultural Revolution unfolded. And during the Cultural Revolution, all religion, foreign and domestic, was outlawed. It was a very fearful time for people who did not toe the line ideologically in China. And at the end of this period, it was a time when churches were shut down, or church buildings were destroyed. People were told to disavow their faith. Parents were not allowed to share their faith with their children even. It was a time of fear, but at the end of it, a more pragmatic group of within the Communist Party took control in 1976. After Mao died, they gradually began to reopen China to the outside world. But no one knew what would be left of the Catholic Church in China. In fact, when the communists took over in China, there were about 3 million Catholics. And that's after 350 years of missionary activity. After the Cultural Revolution and after about 30 years of persecution, there were about 8 million Catholics in China. Catholics held on to their faith, they passed it on to their children, and they even passed it on to their neighbors because it meant something to them during these difficult times. It was not something that foreigners were speaking about. It was something that they themselves were speaking about and sharing with one another. So now there are, I would say, about 12 million Catholics in China, and many of them consider themselves both faithful citizens of their country and faithful citizens of the church. We need to respect and understand that we should not be driving a wedge between Catholics and their government. And interestingly enough, while Catholicism was at one time a strongly rural phenomenon, now lots of people are interested in this faith. They see the church in their city, they go, young people sometimes join, and not in huge numbers, but we see an openness to faith among young people that had not been there before. It's not so much seen as it's seen as somewhat foreign, but also Chinese. They're Chinese priests and sisters and lay people running the church in China. It's a very different phenomenon than it was during the colonial or neo-colonial period.
Right. That's a perfect segue for the question I wanted to ask next. If that's okay, Xueying, if I ask the next one. We wanted to speak about enculturation, which is a topic that all of our friends listening will know well, because we addressed it in the first week with Professor Wang, and then last week with Professor Gemello. So we learned a little bit about Matteo Ricci and Michele Ruggeri, and the history of different missions in an earlier period. But could you give us some insights about the nature of the Chinese church today in terms of enculturation, or maybe to ask the question in a simpler way, maybe simplistic, I don't know. But I mean, if an American went to China and happened upon a Catholic church, would he or she sort of recognize everything, or would certain things be so distinctly Chinese that they would seem new or different?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think the church in China would be highly recognizable to Catholics. When I first went to China, people were still saying the Mass in Latin. China during the Cultural Revolution was cut off from the larger Catholic Church and from all the changes that followed Vatican II. So when they could get their feet back on the ground, they wanted to restore the church that they knew. And that was a church that spoke Latin. So, so in the 1990s, if you wanted to hear a good Latin Mass, you didn't go to Rome, you went to Beijing. But I'd like to stop a minute and reflect on this business of enculturation, because I think we come in with lots of presuppositions. Enculturation means we're gonna engage Confucian philosophy, and we're gonna do this, and we're gonna do that. But let's just step back a little bit and think about, what do we mean by enculturation? It's in fact a very large question, and it has to do with the issue of meaning. Okay, and when you ask about enculturation, what you're saying is, how can people take something and make it meaningful in their context? And my first reaction is, there's no ready-made formula for this. If we're going to respect people's initiative, that means that people have to decide what is meaningful for them. So let me give you an example here. I like to cite an example. I won't cite the specific city, but there was a cathedral in China, a very old cathedral built in the French Gothic style, and they had to replace their windows after the Cultural Revolution. And they brought in a Western architect, Western Catholic architect, and he suggested that they should enculturate. Okay, so he designed windows that married biblical scenes with Chinese artistic motifs, and he made the people Asian, and he did all these things to enculturate. Okay, well, that's fine, but if enculturation means people finding what's meaningful to them, in fact, that was not what the people wanted. Most of the people, they wanted back the stained glass windows that they knew from the past, that they had pictures of, with Mary with blonde hair and all these sorts of things. But it was meaningful to them because it was their history, and that connected them with their past that they had been separated from, and they wanted to reconnect with the universal church. All right. So I think when it comes to enculturation, one of the first things we have to take into account is that it's got to be up to people themselves to decide what is meaningful for them. If meaning is, and this is how I would define it as a sociologist, meaning is how things link up to some larger context. So you take into account your history, your personal experience, your language, and so forth. And then you say, what is meaningful given all that? And sometimes that can change from one generation to the next. It's not just fixed that there's what is meaningful for this generation in China is going to be meaningful for the next generation. Maybe for this generation, older people who remember the past and who want to hold on to some of those things, a certain style of stained glass windows makes sense. Well, the next generation, especially if it includes Chinese who came in, who are new converts and so forth, maybe that history is not as meaningful. Or maybe they will find it meaningful because they're saying, you know, much of my Chinese experience is enclosed within China, and I want to link to the outside world. But we have to let people decide what is meaningful for them. I think that's the first way to think about enculturation. Not, well, we're going to China, we got to look up Confucius, we have to look up this, we have to look up that. Maybe, you know, and if you're an intellectual who has studied Confucian history and philosophy, maybe that's the way to go for you. But enculturation is a varied thing. One further thing, I mentioned the Latin Mass. All right. So again, as Catholics, a lot of people find that Latin Mass very meaningful to them. Even young people who didn't grow up with it, right? And at one time, we thought that having people pray and say the creed and profess their faith in Latin meant that you could standardize the meaning. Right, you know, we're all saying the same creed with the same words everywhere, whether you're in the Congo or in Beijing or in Rome or in Quebec. But even though it's the same text, what it means to people is going to be very different.
Interesting.
You know, what does it mean to somebody who grows up speaking Chinese, who hasn't studied Latin, to read that text? They might know the meaning, but it's this foreign thing that is coming in from outside. Whereas if you're Italian and you say, well, this is Latin and it's a more formal version of the mother tongue of Italian, what happens to be a different meaning? And you've been saying it this way for centuries, right? But it's the same text everywhere, but it may mean something different in each place because of your heritage and your culture and how it came to you. So sometimes for the meaning to stay the same, you have to do something different.
Yeah.
Right. Meaning is a moving target. So when it comes to enculturation, I would just like to say, let's be open-minded and let the Chinese decide what enculturation means for them. And we are fortunate that, in fact, we have a generation of priests, sisters, and lay people in China who are taking that question very seriously. So last week, I was sent an article by a wonderful Catholic sister. Her name is Professor Lina Rong. She got her, I think she got her doctorate at Catholic University of America. I could be wrong about that. And then she has gone back to China and she's been teaching in the seminary, the major seminary in Hebei province. It's in the great city of Shijiazhuang. Now, many people have never heard of Shijiazhuang. It's a city larger than New York. I just want you to know that. Okay.
A medium-sized Chinese city.
Yeah, exactly. Medium-sized Chinese city. And but she's teaching in the seminary there, and she just wrote this article that I'm going to see if I can flash it on the screen here to let you. Oh, there we go. Okay, so she's reflecting on the biblical themes in the Chinese context, exploring a theology of relationships from a biblical perspective in the context of China. She is doing the work of enculturation as we sit here. She's reflecting on scripture and what does it say to us in our context, but also based on our experience, what can we bring to that text, the biblical text, and how can we break it open in a way that means something to us? So this article is published in, let me pull up the citation there. It's published by the Yearbook of Christian Theology, published by Brill. It's this year's Yearbook of Christian Theology. And if you're really interested in this article, you can find out more by signing up for our news blasts. We're going to send out a news blast tomorrow all about this article and the wonderful work of Sister Lina.
Great.
So
thank you so much. Thank you. Wonderful.
Wonderful. Father Agliardo, thank you so much for all these insights. And for me, because I converted to Catholicism in America, a lot of things you're saying are actually even very new to me as well about the Catholic Church in China. But if we do want to bring the Catholic Church in China in comparison with the Catholic Church in other places, for instance, in the West, like US and Europe, and a common challenge that the Catholic Church faces in these places is secularization. So is it also a challenge now in China? Because China is now also a modernized country.
It's very much a challenge. And I think we need to reflect a little bit on what we mean by secular, okay? Because I'm a Jesuit, and Jesuits take the secular world very seriously. We study science, we study the arts, we try to dialogue with other cultures. So secular refers to this world, okay? And Jesuits take this world seriously, and part of our spirituality is to find God in all things. So we don't see the world as an enemy. In fact, we have an incarnational faith. We don't jump over the world to get to God, but God comes to us, enters into our reality. So we do take the world seriously, but secularism as an ideology refers to the idea that the secular world is self-sufficient. This world is self-sufficient and does not need any further reference. It does not need a transcendent reference. And so one of the things that we do as Catholics, we mark culture. In other words, we're a communitarian cultural faith. We put crosses up in the air. We make people put ashes on their forehead. We have public processions. We fast. We have holidays. We mark the time, the day, and place, and our bodies with the faith to put all these reminders of the transcendent into our daily lives, to remind us that the full significance of our world takes place within a larger context. It unfolds within the larger context, which is our relationship with God. So in a secular world, in a certain sense, in the West, what you're being told is, oh, faith is private. It doesn't belong out there all over the place, but it needs to be confined to certain places and certain times. It's confined to Sunday. It's confined, less and less time. Everything else is encroaching on time. We used to have limits to protect the family and faith and community from the encroachment of other things, especially of work and of careerism. But we don't do that anymore. There's a problem in the West. In China, the regime is officially secular, saying there is no further real reference. We are it. And so it's not just cultural pressure that prevents people from taking time out for faith, community, and so forth. It's real pressure. It's legal pressure. So there's often a 6-day work week. There's not a lot of time on Sunday. There's not a lot of time at other times to take out time for prayer. Certainly religious holidays are not recognized in the Chinese school system. There are classes and even exams scheduled on Christmas. So the space for faith, you can't proselytize outside of church grounds. Church publications do not get an ISBN, so you cannot sell them within bookstores. So the legitimate space and time for faith is contracted within China. So the faith is not outlawed, but it's not, the priority is given to the secular. And so it's hard, even if you want to make an intentional decision to practice the faith, you're circumscribed. And that doesn't mean that it's not possible and that people are not allowed to do that. They are. But it's certainly not, we're certainly not thinking about a pre-modern order in which the symbols of faith and meaning and culture were diffused throughout the culture. And there's a unified, as it were, Catholic ethos or Protestant ethos or Buddhist ethos. that pulls everything together in society. Faith everywhere is relegated to a restricted area. And that means that it's up to individuals more and more to try to live the faith. And that's very hard because the faith is something we want to share. It's hard in America. You don't want to talk about it with coworkers. You don't want to, and there's all these activities that exclude faith. Now, Halloween is becoming a big holiday, and Easter and Christmas are Christmas has become a consumer affair. Where do we share something that's meaningful? When do we have the space and time to do that? It's a challenge everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I work in Islamic studies, Father Aguiliardo, and I joke sometimes with my students in the Western world. You can't speak about religion, and it might take a couple of weeks if you meet someone, or maybe years, to find out their religion. In the Islamic world, like going to in a taxi cab in Cairo, in about 5 seconds what everything they think about religion. The first question is, "Hi, how are you? What's your religion?" So, Xueying, we had a question about urban and countryside, but I think I'm going to move on in light of time to the question about intra-Christian relationships. Is that okay with you if I do that?
Absolutely.
Okay, super. So let's go right to that topic. My understanding is the Protestant community is larger than the Catholic community in China, but also, this relatively small minority of the larger Chinese population. Could you speak briefly to that relationship, Catholics and Protestants? Is there a sense of a larger Christian identity, or sort of Catholic a thing and Protestants a thing, and they're two separate communities? And why don't we just start there? Let's start with that, and maybe we'll follow up with a non-Christian religion question.
Yes, there are two different questions. And I think the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church also orient themselves toward other religions a little bit differently as well. I just would like to say the China Association actually has a long history of collaborating with our Protestant colleagues. They've come to our conferences. They've shared their insights with us. We've prayed together. It's been a real great joy. In particular, I think of Joanne Pittman of China Source, who has been just a stalwart and a good friend of the China Association. So we have learned a lot from one another, and I think we also share the sentiment that the division among Christians is a real scandal. It's the result of sin. It's very painful, and from my perspective, I think it's also quite sad that the division within the Christian community has, in a certain sense, been inflicted on China. So that the Christians in China are divided among Protestants and Catholics, and even within these communities there are divisions, and that's not what our Lord has asked of us. Our Lord is very clear that he wants us to be united with one another, and not in professing some ideology, but in love, support, and care of those who are in need. And I think we have to keep that focus: devotion to our Lord, care for those who are in need, living out the gospel values. We need to go back to that vision of Christ if we're all to regain our unity with one another. So I do feel that we have a responsibility as Christians outside of China to work together for the sake of Christians within China, and not to inflict our divisions on them. We both look back to the gospel. We have different traditions, and I'd like to see those traditions as sources of strengths. We have the Catholic Church has a sacramental tradition that it speaks to many people very deeply, and we have a deep theology. We have a tradition of social justice. We reflect deeply on incarnation and what that means. The Protestant tradition, again, has a wide range of denominations, each of which also have their insights to share and their critiques of the church and its tradition. We need to listen to some of those. We have a few critiques of our Protestant brothers and sisters that we could offer in a supportive way. And I think criticism given in love can help us all grow in the light of Christ. So I do think we have a mission before us, and China highlights that mission. In other words, if we're all running to China, each trying to grab our own territory and build our own version of the kingdom, what does that say about who we are and our commitment to the vision of our Lord? So China, in a sense, holds a mirror up to us. That having been said, you've asked a very concrete question. What is the situation of the church in China and the division between Catholics and Protestants? So actually, there's a fourfold division there. So within the Catholic Church, you have those who register with the government and those who have refused to, what we call the unregistered or sometimes the underground church. It's not a separate church. All the bishops are in communion with Rome, but there are different ways of witnessing to the faith in China. And sometimes there are friendly relations between these groups. Sometimes the bishop of the above ground community lives in the same rectory with the bishop of the underground community. The bishop of the underground community is simply not recognized as a bishop by the government. He's recognized simply as a priest, but they kind of work together. In other places, the division is acrimonious. One group is seen as being traitors and so forth. So there are those divisions within the Catholic Church. Within the Protestant Church, there's the Three Self movement that aligned very closely with the government, even before the Cultural Revolution. And there are the house churches that refuse to have anything to do with the government and operate on their own. All right. The house churches are rather nimble. Nobody knows exactly how many people are members of the house churches. They don't need big church buildings. They can meet in small Bible studies. They don't require elaborate theological training for their ministers. They don't have a paper trail quite the same way the Catholic Church does. And that's the group that's growing very, very quickly. So unfortunately, the theology in that group tends to be rather a simplistic form of Calvinism at times, not always, which sees things in terms of the saved versus the damned. It's us versus them. We're the saved. It's a very black and white theology. And Catholics, their view of Catholics goes back to the worst theology of the Reformation. So they see us as these idol worshipers, and we're just as bad as the worst idol worshipers, worse than the ones in Chinese history, because those are not real anymore. The communism has got kind of swept away a lot of that from traditional Chinese culture. Traditional Chinese folk religion has taken a hit, but they see Catholics as the last vestige of it, so to speak. So there's a lot of acrimony. I went to visit a Chinese Benedictine monk up in Minnesota, at St. John's Abbey, and he said, my relatives are Protestants. They won't talk to me now that I've become Catholic, and they just think that this faith of ours is heretical. But they don't go to church and they don't receive communion. They have these underground house churches. So there is a lot to overcome, and some of that goes back to us.
Thank you.
Time is going away quickly from us. So is it okay? Yeah, is it okay for me to ask about ask the question about the future, Gabriel?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Father Argliardo, we're asking you to look to the future with us. In light of young Chinese attitudes to the Catholic Church and religion generally, along with the political questions that the Chinese Church faces, what do you think the Church will look like in the future?
Okay.
Are we looking at a future of growth or decline?
So there are a number of ways to answer, what the future bears, and numbers is one way to look at that, or there's growth in other respects as well. But I think we have to recognize a fundamental fact. The Communist Party and the government in China view their role in society differently than we view the role of our government. We have a limited government and they do not. A limited government means that there are constitutional limits and there are bounds beyond which it does not go. And there are claims that it does not make on people. It allows people a certain freedom to profess whatever they want. Technically in China, there is freedom of religion. But at the same time, the Communist Party doesn't simply claim the territory of China, but it claims the minds and hearts of the people. And as long as there is a rival for that, or as long as they see Catholicism or Buddhism or Islam as some kind of a rival for that devotion and commitment, rather than strengthening it and supporting it, they're going to look with suspicion upon any religious faith. Certainly, if faith becomes an alternative form of nationalism, that will be a problem for them. So Catholics in China have often stressed how their Catholic faith actually makes them better people of China, stronger adherence to their own tradition because it undergirds and gives meaning to their heritage. That wasn't always the faith. Sometimes people felt one more Christian, one less Chinese. That was an old saying, right? But I think, especially in the Jesuit tradition, we've looked at that enculturation question. We've looked at the ways that Christian faith doesn't replace Chinese identity, but it engages it and deepens it. And some of the best and most articulate converts to Christianity early in the Ming Dynasty were these great figures like Xu Guangqi or Li Zhizao or Yang Tingyun, figures who were noted Confucian scholars and officials, but also people who thought, wow, I've encountered this faith, which actually helps me regain my Confucian heritage and strengthens it and gives it a direction and an impetus that it didn't have before. They found that the two work together very beautifully. So again, one of the things we have to do one of the things we have to recognize is the more that we pit Catholicism against Chinese identity, the more we're forcing the Chinese to play a zero-sum game that they don't have to play or don't want to play. We have to recognize that Chinese Catholics can be citizens of their country and committed to many of the accomplishments of the Chinese Communist Party. But at the same time, there are certain lines that we don't cross. I mean, there are themes of social justice that we can affirm, but there are other issues like that are going to be a sticking point, like that transcendent reference. We can't be taking down Jesus's picture and putting up Xi Jinping's. There are limitations. So that is going to be a point of friction. How much devotion and commitment is the Communist Party going to claim? And the further it pushes, the more it's going to push all Christians into a corner, and an unnecessary one, if you ask me. I think that's not a winning strategy for the Communist Party. But I don't run China. That's not my responsibility right now. I will say this. The Protestant churches, house churches, are growing much more quickly than the Catholic Church. That's because they do stay under the radar screen a little more easily. We have cathedrals and bishops, and it's a little harder to hide all that.
Okay.
One of the things that a sociologist did was he predicted. This is a sociologist. I'll leave his name out of this, but he had studied Christianity in China for about a decade, working with Chinese sociologists, and he predicted early in maybe 2012 that by 2035, China would become the largest Christian nation on earth. Right? And that's because the Chinese house churches were going very quickly. They went from 1 million in 1949 to 3 million after the Cultural Revolution to maybe by 2015, 2020, maybe between 60 and 100 million. So even if they don't become the majority within China, there would still be more Christians in China than any place else, any other single country. Well, that's all he needed to do to alarm people. And I think the Communist Party has been watching this. And religion has been on their radar screen, and they instituted in 2018 a series of restrictions on all religious groups because they don't want this thing to get out of hand. And they really want religion to play a supportive role in the regime that they are building.
Well, thank you so much. This it makes me feel even more confident that this was good for WRWC and Think Indeed to bring up this topic and to have you as a guest. We're going to turn to some of the questions that our audience has asked. And Xueying, as usual, please don't hesitate to add in your own perspective. I'm going to ask them pretty quickly because we only have about 10 minutes, maybe 11 minutes for the questions before we have our little conclusion at the end. So, and yeah, we'll try to answer them quickly as well so we get to as many as possible. Okay, so the first is from Grand Rapids, Michigan, I assume. And there's a question about how are priests treated in mainland China today? So any thoughts about that, or maybe you have a personal anecdote about that?
Often, all right, priests are given a lot of respect by the Communist Party in this sense. If there's a public function, they might be brought in and put in the, especially if it's a Catholic area, they'll be put in the front seat. They might participate in public meetings. But the idea is for them to show that they are supporting the communist program for that area. The idea is that everybody should be on the same page to follow the direction of the party. If priests go along with that, they're often involved in different meetings. They can be sometimes taken away from their people and separated from them, but they'll be given privileges, a car, other support. But they'll also be drawn into the world of the party and its priorities. In other places, if they resist that, then they will have problems. So there's kind of a co-optation that priests have to worry about in China. Sisters to a lesser extent, and Catholic lay people to a lesser extent.
Great, thank you. Now we have a question from Ottawa, Canada, in regard to the relationship between Chinese Christianity and other East Asian churches. So, and in fact, it's true, we've advertised this program as the church in Asia, but we've really focused on China with just some allusions here and there to Korea, Japan, and India, especially with Professor Gemello. But Father Agliardo, could you speak to that at all? Are there relationships between the church in, say, South Korea, Japan, other neighboring countries, and China?
So I think that some of the relationship is asymmetrical. So for a while, when the church in China was first trying to get back on its feet after the Cultural Revolution, some of these churches sent in priests and sisters and lay people to teach in the seminaries and to nurture an authentic Catholic faith, a well-rounded Catholic faith in China. So when I taught in the seminary in 2010, in the National Seminary, there was a sister from Korea who was also teaching there. And so that was, again, a great support. But more recently, I think, also Taiwan has been a place where Chinese Catholics could go to study theology and so forth. Chinese Catholics have also gone to the United States and to Europe, but Taiwan is a place that speaks the same language and shares the same tradition and culture. So that's been a very friendly place for them to go. And it doesn't uproot them from their culture and so forth.
Right.
But I think that there has not been enormous ties between the church in China and the other Asian churches.
Okay. Thank you. And just as a reminder to everyone, you're still welcome to submit a question. We have a number of questions, but we might be able to get to 3 or 4 more. And if you want to get yours in there, just click on the link in the chat box and fill out the form really quickly, and it'll populate this nice little spreadsheet I have here. So we have a question about something that we didn't actually get to. So thank you to our questioner from South Bend, which is the relationship between the church and non-Christian religions, and specifically with Taoism. And this friend from South Bend speaks about, can we emphasize larger bonds between spiritual believers when we speak about China, because there is sort of an official ideology, correct me if I get that wrong, of atheism, or maybe atheism is encouraged, but so are there bonds that are formed between, say, Taoists, maybe also people follow Confucianism and Christianity and Xueying? Maybe you have a thought on that too, so that question's open.
So one of the, I mean, this is a nice Western, lovely question about ecumenism and diversity and so forth. We have a little bit of luxury to reflect on those questions in a certain sense that people in China don't have. Like we create a forum and we can invite different religious groups and we can do that and so forth. And that's a little harder to do in China. And when it happens, it's often at the government's invitation. So they have an anti-pollution campaign. Maybe they want to bring together different representatives of the different traditions to reflect on their responsibility to protect the environment. They invite them forward. They all have a forum. They meet one another. They engage in pleasantries, and then they go their separate way. There's not a lot of freedom. We don't have universities in China. We can't create civil society institutions in China. And each religious group is just struggling to maintain its own institutions and presence and beliefs. So there's not an enormous amount of engagement between representatives of different faiths. It's also the fact that not every faith is a faith in the same sense. So in other words, we think of the Catholic Church with universities and intellectuals and representatives who are going to engage on these things. But not every faith is as institutional. Buddhism is sometimes a house culture, a house faith, and there are some Buddhist temples that are in fact not really Buddhist temples. The building has been restored, and then they have people come on and put on the clothes of monks, and they do the rituals, and then they take them off and go home to their family, and it's recreating the ethos, but not the reality. So there's not an institutionalized Buddhism that has universities and spokesperson, and they engage with the same issues that we engage with. If they engage with issues, it's probably very different in different ways. Taiwan, that would be the case, and there's more opportunity in Taiwan, but not in mainland China. Taoism, I'll give you an example of engagement. I know that Catholic priests and sisters have written about, for example, environmental issues and drawn on Taoist themes. So there's that kind of engagement, but I don't know that they've drawn on Taoist people. There's the themes, right?
Interesting.
So it's not as easy to just pick up the phone book, call somebody, and say, "Let's get together and do this," in China.
Right. Thank you so much. Xueying, did you want to add anything about
Yes, I resonate with what Father Michael said about Taoism. Taoism actually as a religion is, I don't know, it's like, to put it really crudely, like a very loose form of religion. So most Taoists, so to speak, are cultural Taoists. Like they would celebrate like village festivals and in honor of some, ancient Chinese heroes, but then everybody goes home and people don't really think much about it. So there's there's early Taoist tradition, which is highly philosophical, like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. That's not what the most Taoists, so to speak, now in China know about. And there are very, very few Taoist professionals in China right now. So I guess I would have to say it is agree with Father Michael that it is a luxury in the West that what do Buddhists think of Christians versus vice versa. In China, people have less interest in each other's religious groups because everybody is marginalized in a way. And only care about focus more on their own religious devotion.
Yes, interesting. Maybe we can get in two quick questions, interesting ones. And the first one I don't know much about, but the question is coming to us from Valparaiso, nearby here in Indiana. And any thoughts on the prospects for the Chinese bishops joining the Federation of Asian Bishops conferences? Maybe that's a big one and touchy, so we can go on to the next one if it's better to move on.
Not my decision.
Okay.
But I hope that they can. I think one of the sticking points is this, though. The Vatican has recognized certain bishops who were excommunicated before and lifted their sentence of excommunication. Right now, every bishop in China is in communion with Rome. However, some of the bishops who refuse to work with the government are not part of the Chinese Bishops' Conference. So it's still an imperfect bishops' conference, and therefore it hasn't been recognized by Rome. And therefore, I don't think that as a conference, it will join the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences until that happens.
Great. And maybe I can get one more in, and it brings us back to the question of ecumenical or intra-Christian relations. You spoke a bit about some of the skepticism that certain Protestant movements have towards Catholics in China. What about the other way around? So we have, it's a long question, I'm only summarizing here, coming from, I think it's also South Bend. How do Catholics look at the different Protestant movements? You referred to two principal ones, the three self-churches and the underground churches. So how do Catholics see those churches? Are they part of the same community from a Catholic perspective?
Well, I think the officially recognized Catholic bishops and the sort of the ones who are more mainstream have been brought together to meetings with members of the Three Self movement. And certainly we've cooperated on things like printing Bibles at the Amity Press Foundation. So there's been some cooperation on certain levels and some gestures of goodwill between those groups. But I think that I've heard Catholic priests complain, Catholic lay people complain about the way that they've been spoken about by certain Protestants in China and attacked and maligned. I don't hear them doing that as much. I hear them saying mostly, we wish that we could sit down and talk with them. And then they would really understand that these tropes that they keep repeating are not really relevant, that we are definitely Christians too. But there's actually a rather interesting linguistic problem that we have to face within China, with the Chinese context.
We have about 20 seconds.
In Chinese, the word for Christ is Jidu, and Protestantism is Jidu Jiao, the teachings of Christ. So it's Protestantism is called Christianity in China.
Very interesting.
All right. And Catholicism is Tianju Jiao, the teaching of the Lord of Heaven. That goes back to Matteo Ricci when he was trying to engage Confucian scholars. So they seem like two different religions, and Protestants sort of claim Christianity for themselves.
Very interesting. Well, there's a couple of important things to say, so don't go yet, everyone. Stick with us for the next minute, please. First and most importantly, we're so grateful to have your collaboration. Xueying, thank you for your friendship and your scholarly collaboration. You've really been a gift to us during this program.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much, Father Aguilardo. I really encourage everyone to follow the work of the U.S.-China Catholic Association. And once again, thank you for being with us.
I appreciate the invitation.
And before you go, everyone, just a couple final notes. This is our last program, so this is goodbye for now. First, I'd like to encourage everyone to stay in touch with the World Religions, World Church program at Notre Dame by following and liking us on Facebook. Just look up NDWRWC. And then as a reminder, all of the programs we've done this year on the Global Church, including the program on Islam and the program on Africa and this program on Asia, China in particular, it's all available. So check in the ThinkND website. All of the podcasts and video interviews and other resources are available. And ThinkND moves on with other great programs. So on Friday, this Friday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, ThinkND begins a new program. And this is the Rome Book Club, who will work with Professor Barry McCrae and cover Primo Levi's The Truce, A Guide to Returning to Life. So consider signing up and following the ThinkND's activity as well. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us. God bless you. Go Irish. Thank you.